Karen walked through the lively streets near the palace, a place that was always full of people. She loved the energy of the crowds, the sound of footsteps and chatter mixing with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages. It was a sunny afternoon, and she was in a great mood, her laughter bubbling up as she passed a cafe. She noticed a couple of friends sitting at a table, sipping their drinks, and waved at them. They waved back, smiling, and Karen continued her walk, feeling carefree. Her eyes then caught something that made her smile even wider. The royal guard standing at attention near the entrance to the palace. The guard, with his tall posture, stiff uniform, and serious expression, looked like the perfect target for a prank. He stood completely still, his eyes fixed on the distance, unaware of the bustling crowd around him. Karen couldn't help herself. She had a mischievous side that always looked for an opportunity to add some fun to her day. It wasn't anything serious, just harmless laughter. Without thinking too much, Karen headed to a nearby cafe and grabbed a bottle of water. Her friends saw her walking over, raising an eyebrow. "What are you up to, Karen?" one of them asked, noticing the bottle in her hand. Karen just grinned. "You'll see," she said, her voice full of excitement. She walked back toward the guard, who still hadn't moved. The idea of soaking him with a little water for fun made her laugh to herself. She had seen people do similar things before, and it was always met with laughter. Nothing big, just a little laugh for everyone, she thought. She raised the bottle and splashed it lightly over his uniform. The water hit the guard's chest, but he didn't flinch. Not a single movement. Karen waited for a second, expecting him to show surprise, anger, or maybe a funny reaction. But he remained as still as a statue, his expression completely unchanged. A couple of people nearby giggled, and Karen's laughter echoed through the street. Her friends joined in, some shaking their heads, but all of them were amused by the harmless joke. Karen was enjoying herself too much to notice the shift in the atmosphere. The crowd around her had stopped laughing, and some people even looked uncomfortable. But Karen didn't pay much attention. She was too busy watching the royal guard, thinking how funny it was that he didn't even react. She was so used to making people laugh that she didn't consider the bigger picture, the consequences of what she had just done. As she turned to walk away, still chuckling, she overheard whispers behind her. The guards, who had been standing nearby, began to whisper among themselves. Some of them exchanged concerned glances, and that's when Karen started to realize maybe her little prank had crossed a line. It was too late to take it back. Her fun was interrupted by a loud voice calling her name. A stern-looking palace officer appeared from the crowd, his face serious, and his eyes fixed on her. Karen froze. "You," the officer said in a calm but firm voice, pointing toward her. Karen's smile faded slightly. She was still unsure of what was happening. Was this all just a misunderstanding? Maybe they were just messing with her, but she had no idea what was about to unfold in the next hour. Karen felt a chill run down her spine as the officer's gaze fixed on her. She had always been someone who prided herself on her quick wit and carefree attitude, but now, standing there in front of this officer, she started to feel a bit out of place. The laughter from the crowd had died down, and she realized that what she had done wasn't as funny as she had first thought. The officer's expression was serious, and there was no hint of amusement in his eyes. "Come with me," he said, his voice calm but firm. Karen hesitated for a moment, still not fully understanding what was happening. She had just splashed a little water on a guard. What was the big deal? It was all in good fun, right? She didn't think it would lead to anything more than a few awkward glances. She looked around, but most of the people in the crowd had turned their attention elsewhere, leaving only a few curious onlookers watching the scene unfold. Her friends, who had been laughing along with her just moments ago, now looked uncertain. They stood by, clearly unsure of what to do, while Karen was left to face the consequences alone. Karen tried to laugh it off, her voice a little shaky. "Hey, come on. It was just a joke," she said, giving the officer a friendly smile. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself, but the officer didn't crack a smile. His face remained as serious as ever, and Karen's heart began to race. She had the strange feeling that this wasn't going to end the way she thought. The officer nodded to the two guards who had been standing near the palace gates. They stepped forward, their expressions cold and unmoving, as they joined the officer's side. Karen realized that this wasn't some small misunderstanding. This was much more serious than she had first realized. She could feel the eyes of the remaining crowd on her, some of them whispering among themselves. The pressure was starting to get to her. What was she supposed to do now? "Please, I didn't mean any harm," Karen tried again, but the officer raised his hand, silencing her. "You will need to come with us," he said, his voice unyielding. There was no room for negotiation, and the authority in his tone left Karen feeling helpless. For the first time, she understood that this situation wasn't going to be resolved with a simple apology or a smile. Karen's mind raced. Was this really happening? A small prank had turned into something much more serious, and she had no idea how to fix it. The officer's demeanor was unshakable, and before she could argue further, the guards moved in to escort her. She glanced over her shoulder at her friends, hoping one of them would step in, but they only looked on in disbelief. It was clear that they didn't know what to say either. Karen was gently but firmly led away from the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. She kept thinking that maybe, just maybe, someone would step in and say it was all a misunderstanding. But as she was guided toward the nearby palace gate, it became painfully clear that no one was coming to her rescue. She had gotten herself into something she couldn't easily get out of. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago now felt like a distant memory, and all she could focus on was the uncertain path ahead. As Karen was escorted away from the crowd, the feeling of confusion and disbelief grew stronger inside her. She had never imagined that a simple prank would lead to this. The officers were calm, but their serious expressions made her nervous. She tried to remind herself that it was just a little water, something playful, nothing more. But as they walked toward the palace entrance, she noticed how everyone seemed to be watching her with a mix of curiosity and judgment. The officer who had spoken to her earlier remained silent, but his presence was enough to keep her in line. Karen kept glancing around, half hoping for someone to step forward and explain that it was all a mistake, but no one did. The street had become eerily quiet, and the few bystanders who were still lingering seemed to avoid eye contact with her. It was as if they had all agreed that she was in the wrong, and Karen felt more alone than ever. They reached a tall, imposing door guarded by more royal guards, their faces just as stern as the ones she had seen earlier. Karen felt a pit form in her stomach. This was no longer a minor incident. It was something much more serious than she had realized. As the door creaked open, Karen's mind raced. What was going to happen to her? She had always been the kind of person who lived in the moment, but now she wished she had thought things through. Inside, the atmosphere was far different from the cheerful street outside. The room was cold and bare, with stone walls that seemed to close in on her. The officers motioned for her to sit, and Karen reluctantly obeyed. She looked around, but there were no windows, no clocks, and no indication of how long she would be kept here. The only sound was the occasional shuffle of footsteps from the guards stationed outside the door. Karen tried to speak, her voice shaky. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The officer who had led her in gave her a measured look, but didn't respond right away. His silence made the weight of the situation sink in even further. It felt like hours passed as she waited for him to speak, but when he finally did, his tone was even more serious than before. "What you did today was not just a harmless prank," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. "You have shown disrespect to a member of the royal family's military unit. A royal guard is not someone to be treated as an object of humor." Karen's stomach tightened as she realized the gravity of what she had done. She had thought it was funny, a harmless joke to share with her friends, but now it seemed like it was much more than that. The guard she had splashed wasn't just anyone. He was a symbol of authority and discipline. "I didn't mean any disrespect," Karen said quickly, her voice a bit more desperate now. "It was just a joke. I never thought it would go this far." But the officer didn't seem to soften at her words. Instead, he glanced at her, almost as if he was waiting for her to fully understand the consequences of her actions. "You didn't consider the consequences," he replied. "Now you will need to be held accountable." Karen's heart sank as the reality of the situation became clearer. She had no idea what to expect, but the officer's words made it clear that things weren't going to end the way she thought. What started as a harmless prank had now turned into a serious matter, and there was no easy way out. Karen's heart was racing, and her palms were beginning to sweat. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but everything in her gut told her it wasn't going to be good. She sat there, her mind spinning, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. She had always been the life of the party, the one who made everyone laugh. And now, in this cold, sterile room, she felt completely out of place. The officer had just made it clear that what she had done was serious, and the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the officer finally stood up. He turned to another guard who had been silently watching in the corner of the room and exchanged a few quiet words. Karen strained to hear, but the only word she caught was detention. Her chest tightened. Detention. Was she going to be locked up for this? Her mind raced through every possible outcome, but nothing made sense. A prank had turned into something far worse than she could have ever imagined. The officer came back into view, his face as emotionless as before. He moved toward her, and for a moment, Karen thought he was going to speak again, but instead, he simply gestured for her to stand. "Come with us," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. Karen hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Her legs felt heavy, like they had been rooted to the floor, but after a long pause, she pushed herself up from the cold chair and followed the officer out of the room. As they walked down a dimly lit hallway, Karen couldn't help but feel the weight of every step. She was led past other guards, all of whom ignored her, their faces as stern and serious as the officers. It seemed like the whole palace was designed to intimidate. Its tall, stone walls, its cold atmosphere, and the guard who never smiled or seemed to relax. She couldn't help but think how far removed it all was from her carefree life just hours before. The officer led her down several hallways before finally stopping at a thick iron door. He unlocked it and stepped aside. "Inside," he ordered. Karen didn't move at first, her feet glued to the ground. She could hear the heavy door creaking behind her, the sound echoing in the silence. It was only when the officer's cold gaze met hers that she stepped forward, reluctantly crossing the threshold. The room was small and bare, with nothing but a thin mattress in the corner and a single barred window that let in just a sliver of daylight. Karen's breath caught in her throat. This was a holding cell, a place for people who were waiting to face serious consequences. The officer didn't say another word as he closed the door behind her, leaving her alone in the small, cold room. Karen stood there for a moment, staring at the bare walls, trying to process what had just happened. She had never felt so small, so insignificant. A wave of regret washed over her as she sat down on the mattress. She had been so focused on making everyone laugh, on pulling off a harmless prank, that she had never thought about the bigger picture. She had no idea that something so simple could get her into this much trouble. She ran her fingers through her hair, her mind racing, trying to think of a way out, but nothing came to her. All she could do now was wait, and the thought of what would happen next terrified her. What would she be facing? And how had her life turned upside down so quickly? Karen sat on the edge of the thin mattress, staring at the small barred window that allowed only a sliver of light to filter through. The silence around her felt suffocating, and every little noise in the hallway seemed amplified in the cold, empty room. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had fallen into some sort of strange, surreal dream, one that she couldn't wake up from. How had something as small as a prank turned into this? She had been so carefree, so sure that it was all in good fun. Now, everything felt different. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and regret. She replayed the events in her mind, hoping for a different outcome, but the reality was undeniable. She had doused a royal guard with water, something that had seemed harmless in the moment, but had now spiraled into something serious. The officer's words from earlier echoed in her head. You didn't consider the consequences. She hadn't. She had never even thought about the implications of what she had done. To her, it had been a joke, just a small act of mischief. But now, locked in a small room with no answers, she understood that it was more than that. Her mind kept circling back to the guard. His stoic expression as the water hit him, the way he didn't react at all. She had expected him to flinch, to show some emotion, but he had stayed perfectly still. Now she realized that was probably what had made the situation worse. The guards, the officers, they had seen it as a sign of disrespect. She had unknowingly challenged the authority of the royal military. The weight of it all was starting to sink in, and it felt like a heavy burden pressing down on her chest. She stood up, pacing the small room in an attempt to calm her nerves. There was no clock, no indication of how long she had been there. It felt like hours, but it could have only been minutes. Time seemed to stretch in that small space, making her feel even more isolated. Every step she took echoed against the walls, a constant reminder that she was completely alone in this. As she walked back to the mattress, she tried to think of how she could fix this. But the more she thought, the more helpless she felt. She had never been in trouble before, not like this. She had always been the one who could talk her way out of things. But this time, it seemed different. There was no one to talk to, no one to explain that it had just been a silly joke. The officers hadn't cared about her excuses. They hadn't cared about the fact that she didn't mean any harm. They were serious about what had happened, and Karen now knew that she was going to have to face whatever consequences came next. She lay back on the mattress, staring up at the ceiling. Her mind continued to race with possibilities, none of which were comforting. What if she ended up in prison? What if she lost her freedom over something as ridiculous as a prank? She couldn't even begin to imagine how this would affect her life. Would she be able to go back to her normal routine? Would anyone even believe her if she tried to explain? The more she thought about it, the more it seemed like her carefree attitude had led her into a trap of her own making. She had never thought about the consequences of her actions. And now, here she was, stuck in a situation that she couldn't easily escape. Her playful nature, her desire to make people laugh, had taken her down a path she never intended to go. And now, all she could do was wait for whatever would happen next. The minutes seemed to drag on endlessly in the cold, barren room. Karen couldn't escape the thoughts swirling in her head. She sat in the corner of the small cell, her knees drawn up to her chest, as she tried to figure out what had gone wrong. Every so often, she would stand up, pacing around the room, hoping to shake off the sense of helplessness that seemed to weigh her down. She had been so sure that everything would be fine. But now, everything felt like it was falling apart. Her mind kept returning to the same question. How had she gotten here? It had been such a small thing, a little joke, a harmless prank on a royal guard. She hadn't thought it would cause such a reaction. It was just water, for goodness sake. Yet here she was, trapped in a cold cell, facing consequences she never imagined. The door to her cell creaked open suddenly, interrupting her thoughts. Karen looked up, startled. The officer who had first spoken to her stood in the doorway, his face as serious as before. Behind him was another figure, someone new. Karen couldn't see their face, but they wore a sharp uniform, and their posture was just as rigid as the guards she had seen earlier. The officer motioned for her to stand. Karen, the officer said, his voice firm. You're going to be questioned now. Karen's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this, but now that it was happening, she felt a wave of panic wash over her. She had no idea what kind of questions they were going to ask, and the thought of answering them made her stomach churn. What could she say? How could she explain herself? She followed the officer down the hallway again, her steps hesitant, but there was no turning back now. The other figure remained silent, following closely behind. They stopped in front of another door, larger than the one she had been locked in. The officer knocked, and a voice from within called for them to enter. Karen felt her chest tighten as she walked into the room. The space was more official than the holding cell, with a large wooden desk in the center. Behind it sat a man, dressed in a much more elaborate uniform than anyone she had seen before. His expression was calm but intense, and he didn't look up immediately as they entered. He motioned for Karen to sit across from him. The officer who had escorted her in stepped to the side, leaving Karen alone in the room with the man. She tried to sit up straight, but her nerves made it difficult to keep still. She could feel her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The man behind the desk finally looked up, his sharp eyes meeting hers. "You are Karen, correct?" he asked, his tone measured but stern. Karen nodded, her mouth dry. "Yes, that's me," she replied, her voice quieter than she had intended. The man didn't say anything at first, just studied her with a keen gaze. It was clear that he was trying to assess her, to see if she was truly remorseful for what she had done. Karen felt her pulse quicken. She had no idea what he was thinking, but she knew that this conversation would determine what happened next. "I've been told about your actions earlier today," he said finally, his voice unwavering. "Dousing a royal guard with water is no small thing. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Karen opened her mouth to speak but found that no words came out. What could she say? She hadn't thought about the gravity of the situation when she made the decision to splash the guard. All she had wanted was a laugh, a harmless joke, but now that she was sitting here, face to face with someone who clearly saw things differently, she realized how wrong she had been. I didn't mean to disrespect anyone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was just a joke. I didn't think it would be such a big deal." The man behind the desk didn't react immediately, but his gaze softened just slightly. "It's not about the joke, Karen," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's about what your actions represent. You've shown a lack of respect for an institution that is held in high regard. It's not something we can overlook lightly." Karen felt her throat tighten, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. She had no excuses, no way to explain away what had happened. All she could do was sit there and listen, the truth of the situation sinking in with every passing second. This wasn't just about her. It was about the honor and dignity of the Royal Guard, something far bigger than her harmless prank. She realized that her actions, though unintended, had consequences that reached far beyond her. The man behind the desk leaned back in his chair and folded his hands in front of him. "We will need to investigate this matter further, but you should know that your behavior today has put you in a difficult position. You will be held accountable." His words were measured, and they made Karen's stomach churn. Karen sat in the cold, sterile room, her thoughts racing. The words of the man behind the desk echoed in her mind. "You will be held accountable." She had expected some form of punishment, but hearing those words made everything feel real. It wasn't just a small misunderstanding that could be brushed off with a quick apology. It was something that had consequences. And now, Karen felt trapped, as though there was no way out. As she sat there, the door opened again, and the officer who had escorted her in earlier stepped inside. His expression was still serious, but Karen noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor. He wasn't as cold or stern as before. He looked at her for a moment, his eyes softening slightly. "We've reviewed the situation," he said, his voice calmer now. "The decision has been made." Karen's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what to expect, but the suspense was almost unbearable. Her mind was filled with questions. What kind of punishment would she face? Would she be locked up for weeks? Months? Would her life ever go back to normal? The officer paused for a moment, letting the tension build in the air. Karen sat still, trying to steady her breath. The silence felt so thick, like it was pressing down on her chest. She had never felt more uncertain in her life. "We've decided that your actions, while disrespectful, were not done with malicious intent. The officer continued, his tone more neutral now. However, they still require some form of consequence. Karen's stomach twisted as she braced herself. This wasn't a relief, not yet. She had no idea what kind of consequence he was referring to. She swallowed hard, hoping it wouldn't be something too severe. The decision is that you'll be given a fine, he said, and some community service to make amends for what happened. You'll also be required to apologize formally to the royal guard you affected. Karen blinked, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. A fine. Community service. That was it. It didn't sound too bad compared to what she had imagined. She had been expecting something far worse, longer imprisonment or even more severe punishment. But a fine and community service, that seemed almost manageable. The officer looked at her for a long moment, studying her reaction. "Do you understand the terms?" he asked. Karen nodded quickly, still processing everything. "Yes, I understand," she said, her voice a little shaky. The officer seemed satisfied with her response, and nodded. "Good. You'll be given the details of your sentence soon. For now, you are free to go, but don't forget that this was a serious matter. We expect you to respect the rules from here on out." Karen's mind was spinning. She had been expecting something much worse, and while a fine and community service were certainly not pleasant, they were a far cry from what she had feared. She felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. She hadn't realized just how much she had been dreading the worst-case scenario until it was over. The officer motioned for her to stand. "Come with me, and I'll show you out." As they walked through the halls of the palace again, Karen couldn't help but feel the weight lifting off her shoulders. The worst was behind her, and while the punishment wasn't ideal, it was far less than she had feared. Her heart was still racing, but it was from a sense of relief rather than dread now. When they reached the doors, the officer gave her one last look. "Make sure you learn from this, Karen. The royal guard is not something to take lightly." Karen nodded quickly, her throat tight as she realized how lucky she had been. She had learned her lesson, perhaps a little too late, but she would make sure to never make the same mistake again. She stepped out into the bright sunlight, breathing in the fresh air as if it were her first breath of freedom. Everything seemed to feel lighter, and the world outside felt a little more forgiving. But she knew she would never forget the seriousness of the day. The experience had been a hard lesson, but it was one she wouldn't soon forget. She was going to make sure that the next time she tried to bring laughter, it wouldn't come at the expense of respect or consequence. Back home, Karen thought things would return to normal. But she was wrong. The moment she landed, she felt the weight of what had happened. She switched on her phone and was bombarded with messages. Some were from friends and family, others from people she didn't even know. The video of her throwing water on the royal guard had gone viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. At first, she thought people might find it funny, but as she scrolled through the comments, her heart sank. "Disrespectful," one person wrote. "This is why tourists have a bad name," another said. Even some of her friends were disappointed. "Karen, what were you thinking? That's not how you behave in another country," one text read. She felt embarrassed. She never expected such a reaction. She thought it was just a small prank, but now, the whole world was talking about it. Some people even made memes about her. Karen tried to ignore the comments, but they kept coming. News channels started covering the story. She saw herself on TV, with reporters discussing how her actions had led to her arrest. She couldn't believe it. Was she really that person now? The tourist who disrespected another country's traditions and got banned. It was a hard pill to swallow. Her family wasn't happy either. Her husband gave her a long lecture. "You should have known better," he said, shaking his head. "Now our name is out there for the wrong reasons." Even her parents called, telling her they were disappointed. Her younger sister, who always looked up to her, simply said, "I can't believe you did that." Karen thought about what had happened. Sitting alone in her room, she replayed the moment in her mind. The royal guard had just stood there, doing his job. He didn't laugh. He didn't react. And yet she had found it funny at the time. But was it really? Now she saw it differently. It wasn't a joke. It was a lack of respect. She decided to take responsibility. She posted a video apologizing for her actions. "I made a mistake," she admitted. "I didn't think about how my actions could affect others. I want to say sorry to the Royal Guard, to the people of the UK, and to everyone who felt disrespected by what I did. I have learned my lesson." Some people accepted her apology, while others still criticize her. That was the thing about the internet. Once something was out there, it never really went away. Karen knew that no matter what she did, this incident would always be part of her story. But she had changed. The experience taught her a valuable lesson. Respect matters, no matter where you are. Traditions exist for a reason. And most importantly, a joke is only funny if no one gets hurt. From that day on, she promised herself she would think twice before acting on impulse. Some lessons in life come easy, but this one came with a price.